Okay, I was delighted to be asked to come and meet this fantastic bunch of people and to talk about education in the very broadest sense. And so as a moderator, I suppose I'd like to just introduce some very, very basic and simple ideas, and also perhaps give a slight account. Obviously, I cannot be fantastically pan-internationalist cool in that respect, so I have to talk slightly about certain relationships between education and art, pretty much from my understanding. And I'd like to talk about two things, which of course we will be touching on, which is one, which is the actual idea of people learning about art, how to make art or to participate in it, and the other, which is the gallery education, which of course the idea of the dissemination or the notion of comprehension for the public more generally. And in Britain this has changed tremendously, and I would just like to give a slight sort of chart in the relationship between education and art. I'm pretty obsessed still with the role of the art school. I think that an art school, and I'm speaking obviously about architecture a bit, more generally, okay? I'm obsessed with the role. I mean, let's not be too liberal. I'm going to have to say the art school is quite an interesting structure, and in Britain it's been kind of very dominant, but we've moved from ideas where someone like Howard Hodgkin, very much from a very kind of upper class position, would say, oh, really, art schools aren't necessary, you can teach yourself. You can if your uncle has a library of art historical material. From a kind of liberal art education through to notions of accountability, the idea that people have to produce a massive amount, actually produce, through to incredible emphasis on theory and learning and academicization of art in order to justify it because of the sort of guilt about art in the first place in our old social democracy. So these are just a few very general points. I'm also fascinated with the idea of the role of education in the gallery and the fact that obviously people are properly curators opposed to education officer in galleries, and now curate and organize programs, part of which this work with the Bronx Museum here around Sarah Z's work is very much part of that idea of really something extending and being art itself, of course. So before you all jump on me and think I'm being a bit old school, I just feel you have to establish these points and talk about these definitions. And Anita, I'd like to start off by asking you to introduce us to this fantastic project here in Venice, which ended in 2001, I believe. Could you explain it?
Yes. In 1996, I started a project at the Guggenheim Museum here in Venice, which I called Public, and the idea was really to address what public is. Is public an aware subject, or is it just an objectified audience, so-called? So the aim was to stimulate, really, through dialogue and availability to reciprocal listening, an action which was really operating towards oneself and towards the other in terms of collective creative work, you know. And this actually happened because what I did, I didn't have any pre-configured team to discuss, and I wanted to really get rid of the separation between observer-observed, which is typical of the spectacle business. And the idea was to have this kind of jam session, so in which all the participants, they just contributed without an extensive preparation, of course. And so all together, in a way, we were all surprised by what in the process was kind of coming together. It was a sort of a symphony.
So who came?
Yeah, I had from artists to biologists, mathematicians, architects, musicians. I mean, a very diversified crowd of people. They happened usually when the museum was closing, so at 7 p.m. And they have been sponsored by trustees of the Guggenheim. And so it was really a project which went on for 5 years at the Guggenheim, weekly meetings at 7 p.m. We were starting eating, because at the Guggenheim Museum in Venice we have this beautiful location with restaurant, etc. So we started eating and being very, so, you know, low-key and kind of very social, drinking and eating. And then at 9, let's say, we went all in the library and to really seriously do this attempt to create a as boys would have said, a social sculpture, you know, this kind of sculpting together with one's ideas, something new.
So would you pick an idea every time?
No, actually, the idea was to create all the time this possible togetherness, this possible symphony. So this was my introduction. And of course, my rule was also to be able to, you know, to interrupt when somebody was a little bit too heavy and
boring.
Yes, or boring, and to encourage. But also, but I understood that also the listening is an activity. Plus, one thing I want to add. When words are not used to just recreate and represent an idea of truth, of reality or whatever, but they are coming out, bursting out like something original, something authentic, and that's what I was talking before, then people get really conscious about their own creativity. So this is a very incredible experience. And I think that this is what makes, and here we go to the education, I think that this, recreating an authentic experience about self-expression through a word, as an act, as an action, it really brings people to their center and to their self-awareness.
But that, I think that's fascinating, and I just want to ask, the importance was the actual experience as opposed to the account of it or the documentation or any of that. So it's actually what you call first-hand.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. That's kind of interesting because obviously we often find that everything is kind of justified by its manifestation in many other forms.
Right.
Or it's sort of, so the idea of the experience is perhaps closer to...
Experience is the opposite of information,
art.
so that's the point, you know. We are filled with information. So let's get into experience, you know. And talking about perception is if we don't get into experience and therefore perception, we are not shifting anything. So that's my point.
And Anita, after 5 years of doing this,
I was exhausted.
apart from exhaustion, what else do you think when you look back on it? What do you think you created? Was it?
I was myself.
Public?
Oh yeah, that's the point. Now, I really thought that we were about creating something very, very cooperative. Well, I was wrong. What we had created was a shared language about intimacy in a way, but that kind of intimacy stayed as a subjective experience. We never jumped it because at the end I wanted to create a website, Ethics TV. I wanted to create art as a system of participative system. I wanted to have everybody, you know, enthusiastic about doing something together. No, everybody was for her, himself, you know, doing, but probably starting to become conscious about one's own, you know, identity, creative identity, which is not bad.
So the architectural, I mean, let's say the thing that you talked about, the way you met was some sort of within an art school, I mean, an architecture school, a sort of group, a problem solving. Yeah. Is there any similarity?
I think it's, you know, this experience, of course, is so rich and interesting, and I was kind of looking for a way to kind of connect to what we do at the Bronx Museum, which has some of the challenges that led you to create this program, but in a sort of a different way. So, but what struck me in your description of the project is actually the emphasis on language. And when you say that You're looking for people to come up not with maybe cliche descriptions of artworks, but to actually say with their own words. And I think that is a really kind of key point in the art education process, which I think it's to allow the viewer's voice into the discourse. And I think when we met with Renato and his colleagues at IUAV, one of the things that we talked about was how we could inoculate into the architectural discipline, which is a language that is so closed just to people who knows that language, how we could actually bring in the voices of those people that they do not speak that language. So because of that, we begin to plan this idea of bringing or developing a program with the youth in the Bronx and here in Venice, and create this dialogue between them.
And by youth, you mean just before sort of
high school?
Yeah, okay.
Here is
really
the Liceo in Venice. We selected 15 kids, age maybe 15 to 17. And in the Bronx, we also did the same thing, but we already have a program for youth there. So for a number of months, these two groups were just kind of exchanging information. And it was a little bit about art, but it was mostly about, because we wanted to do this about architecture and urban planning. So they were kind of looking at their own area, their own region, and looking at maps, and then telling each other how the Bronx was and how Venice was, and have this kind of dialogue. So dialogue and language, it's kind of, you know, at the core of...
and the dialogue was through what? I mean, how did they talk to each other?
It was kind of interesting because, you know, now everything is so so fluid.
Yes.
So we had the people Skyping each other. They created a Facebook page, and sometimes they would make calls. They sent email, and eventually they actually, each group put a packet together. The kids here in Venice put a packet with a bunch of things in Venice, and the kids in the Bronx, and they exchanged these gifts, so opening up. So in a sense, it was a little bit about getting to know each other. But also for us, I think it was bringing into this very kind of structured discourse or language, the voices of, I think I remember, Renato, when we first met, we talked about how important it was for us and the architects and the professors to hear how people experience, you know, the urban landscape without that sort of specific language.
Yes.
So that was kind of the basis of it. Yeah. And I think, you know, maybe there is a point of contact with what you did at
yes, also for us, it was very important, very interesting to accept this idea, because normally in our school we do in July at the end of the academic year an immersive experience of students called workshop, design workshop or charrette. And so we decided to melt with this possible relationship with the pavilion in Biennale and the works of Sarah. And what is interesting is our school is an architecture, but also an art faculty. And so it's very interesting for us in this case to merge the two, the experience we are driving on. And in reality, this is also occasioned by the fact that we founded very recently a department, mixed with art and architecture, and is in a way a very important thing for us. And I think it's very good to remind your key word, experience, because the experience in art, I think in all the artistic production in this moment is based on experience, is very important, and particularly in Sarah's work is very central, this experience of space, this experience of the perception of space, and this is very important also for architecture in this moment.
Right.
And so I think coming to the education, it's very important to intervene for the student in an experience, immersive
workshop
organization
or
of the workshop. There's a last thing.
No, that's fine.
What could be in our experience? What is wrong in the workshop experiences is that is overlapping the theoretical items, and this is not good, I think. And what is interesting in Sarah's experience is that making the art work, she is making theory, and this is very interesting to connect.
I mean, I think what you said is fascinating, because in my position as somebody who teaches a lot of art at the Royal College at postgraduate level, the notion of the experience is sort of very secondary. So a lot of people don't even feel they can say what they see, because in a way they don't feel however educated that what they see is viable. It's much more to do with the sort of a conceptual and theoretical apparent underpinning. So you often are telling people who either kind of talking nonsense or in total fear, but there's a relation that actually everyone from 15-year-old through, and I'm not just being soppy and liberal, but actually do know a lot more about things than they realise, because of this common thing of experience and seeing, and this kind of democratic moment at which we all start, and then some people perhaps know more. But people are paralysed through our education system, through the fact that experience is like just for the pub, is just secondary, and knowledge or theory is something kind of very specialised. And what do you reckon?
No, I was just sort of smiling with recognition, because although I'm based in Hong Kong now, I spent a lot of my life, as you can probably tell, in London, and I'm originally from Lahore in Pakistan. But while in London, I did a little bit of lecturing and also ran an art space, and I remember asking a postgraduate student who'd just come in to see a work by an artist that she had no conception of, because it was coming from a very different cultural space. And I asked her, you know, what do you think? And the response was, I don't know, I'll have to go read and come back to you.
Of course.
And that was just astonishing to me.
And that's totally true.
And I think it raises questions as to what we are educating people to do, or what we are educating people out of, rather than towards.
I mean, at some level we're telling people they can't be sort of, that in a way you can't know because you're from somewhere else and all that, but actually there is that notion of language that is common.
Yeah, language is also really interesting. I mean, as a concept, you know, I work for a small organization called the Asia Archive, but although it may be small in scale, the ambition is, as you can tell by the name, is rather huge. Also because, as you can't tell by the name, the archive isn't just a place which holds dusty books and, you know, you wear gloves and a mask when you go in to look at them. In a place, in an area of the world which is, you know, a third of the population, if not more, where the academy does not have the sort of hold that the sort of places I think you guys have had a lot of your experience in, where museums do not perform the function of sort of canon making, of public making. the role that we can play is really limited only by our ambitions, because you're making up for a lot of these lacks of infrastructure, particularly around knowledge infrastructure. So one of the important things for us is to rethink how we develop programs, so that we are not just copying, insituating, actually these divisive this is learning, this is education, this is programming, this is an exhibition. Oh, if you've done Sanskrit, that means you should do late Indian. If you've done Persian, you must do late Islamic. Well, actually, they existed at the same time.
Right.
If you can't speak both languages, that's your problem. Find somebody else who does, and then talk to each other. So it forces us, I think, to think through how we do it, and it's a large topic. But let me just give one specific example. Over the last few years, there's been a specter of the global show, the survey, geographic, regional, packaged up nicely for easy consumption. And that produces a certain rhetoric and discursive and a flattening and et cetera. And Hong Kong has sort of hosted one of these things that also was shown in London. And I was talking with the team of saying, how do we talk about this? And with whom? And the idea was, oh yes, we do lots of work with secondary schools and teaching in Cantonese, and with teachers who don't necessarily have the tools, haven't sort of grown up going to exhibitions, museums don't have a lot of the tools that would just be second nature. So, that's one category. Another is around artists, so people just interested. Over the last 5-6 years, the market has exploded in Hong Kong, but the infrastructure, certainly around knowledge creation, hasn't.
Not at all.
Right.
So, what happens when you create that gap? What happens also in how people think, how artists think about validation, about themselves, about confidence, around the language to critique these things. So what we came up with was the idea of, let's work together. And we will host a series of talks, not unlike in spirit with this one, where we invite different people to talk about, framing, how does one begin to talk about an exhibition, particularly through which purports to represent. And let's look at it over time. Let's look at what these things are. Let's look at different histories. So let's get a historian in. Let's look at the space. So you cannot talk about Hong Kong in any way without looking at space.
Right. The context.
And it's actually been surprising for me just looking at the number of artists or people who are active in the arts world who are actually coming from architecture. And sort of the conflation between thinking through that, I think is really quite impressive. And through these talks, we have these talks which are open to everybody, including sort of teachers. And then for teachers, we have a lab after these talks where we work with artists who teach, or sort of other folks who are familiar with the idea of using language and using in a different register, to then work with them, to workshop with them what they heard, and what it sort of opens up, and therefore what kind of exercises they will want to develop working with their students.
That sounds excellent. I mean, because obviously, particularly for artists, it's incredibly important for artists to teach those people called youth, if not someone else, or to be involved in that kind of idea of just passing on something at a very early stage. And especially somewhere like Hong Kong, where there is this insane art market now, where you get terrible defensiveness otherwise on the part of artists in places where the market. And I was thinking of an example. You were talking about how countries get suddenly taken up and then dropped, sort of notions like Mexico. Poor Mexico had one hell of a time. Say 10 years ago when everyone became obsessed. No, I'm not worried, but I'm just saying this really ridiculous relationship to the idea, the kind of exoticization, this idea of Mexican art. And And the Mexican artists that do very, very well have all trained at architecture school, because there is far less of a tradition of an art school there. Someone like Guadalajara, there's like a whole lot of very good artists who've come out of architecture school, who've managed to kind of counter, through kind of a relationship to architectural practicality, the making of an object.
This is true of all Latin America.
Yeah.
We are actually doing an exhibition at the Bronx Museum that's specifically about that.
Oh, good. Can you talk about
How in South America, because of mostly because of some military governments, they close the humanities, but architecture is actually considered a technology kind of thing.
Yeah.
So,
That's so
people
cool.
interested in interested in the arts, they would go to architecture
Yes.
Yeah.
as a way to actually be exposed to our history and this and that. So
Yes.
you have a number of artists in South America that they are trained as architects.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's interesting because it entirely changes the discourse of art by that kind of. I really am very interested in these hybrids and this kind of idea of inoculating one language with another.
I am, my position is we must design not object but relations. And
I agree.
it's very important to have also, for this reason I'm also interested in Sarah's work, because we must design also emotion. And this is one of the problem of architecture now. And this is deeply humanist, I think.
Yeah, but art is, in a way, what makes art different from just not art is that it acknowledges relationship. I mean, this is what it is. So, and I don't think that we should narrow down art to just painting or visual art, or, I mean, art is really something which should encompass, you know, architecture as well as even the idea of caring, of education, you know. And because this is really just related to a market target, the idea of saying art as photography or, you know, as sound installation, video, film. It, as you see, it broadens it up increasingly, you know, taking in everything. Now it's the question is architecture art? Of course it is, you know, as long as it considers the context, the relationship, and with quantum physics, you know, now we know that we are all there simultaneously, so, and we are all related. So, I mean, this is what we have really.
I think that's the nub of the point, which is that we're all there simultaneously.
Yes, that's it.
And you know, with quantum physics, you know, there's this concept of high noon state. So, which is what like the CERN collider was doing, which is you accelerate subatomic particles to such a high speed that at one point the particle can take multiple parts at once.
Right.
And I think that's precisely art.
Yes,
'cause
exactly.
It has those complex relationships.
Right.
Not just with the market, but also with our cultural selves.
Of course.
But also as our with our
Human.
social selves.
Yes, yes.
And you know, one little well, it's not a little project, but a project that we're doing in India, which gets to the subject of language. Because I think when we're talking about language, we're talking about discourse, and we're not actually meaning sort of languages, which is another issue. But in India, what we're trying to do right now is develop a bibliography of art writing in 100 years in over 11 different languages. And one of the interesting things is that a lot of the leading Indian critics haven't had access to many of these things. And as you move from, you know, Kerala to Bengal to, you know, Orissa to Assam, and you look at the different languages, what you find is that the discourse is very different. You know, and in certain places, the key place for writing on art is, you know, a communist propaganda broadsheet. In another place, it's a literary magazine. In another place, it's the architecture school, which sort of, you know, shields things. And what that then does to also ideas of history. So, you know, when was modernism? Well, it depends if you ask the guy speaking in Malayalam or the guy speaking in Bengali. And therefore, to the English-speaking, you know, critic in Delhi, when was modernism, becomes a very...
But it's kind of interesting because you can transfer this entire reality to New York, and if you ask what's modernism to a curator at MoMA, he'll say something.
Right.
If you ask what's modernism to a curator at the Met, this person's going to say something different. So it's like this very elastic kind of definition of, you know, of terms. So.
In fact.
I'll just give a funny, I don't want to, you know, this like all around the world sort of stuff is a bit overdone at times, but just a quick, years ago I was speaking at a conference, an IECA, International Art Critics Conference, about Palestine in Ethiopia. And I went with a lot of these real old school, proper theoretical art critic people, French mainly. We went to the art school, and there is a very, very important art school in Addis Ababa, which was set up, well, I'll just give you a clue. So we went there, and these kind of post-structural, God knows what people were there, really serious. And we opened up one of the doors, and there are a lot of people doing a lot of really heavy social realist painting, kind of Ethiopian style, because of the relationship to the Soviet Union and so on. The teachers had come over from there. So then we sat down, and these people were just completely horrified at what they were seeing, and I just thought it was absolutely fantastic. Also fantastic and fascinating, and how incredible when you're talking about who thinks about modernism at what time. That was like the biggest kind of seismic, strange time things. If you'd opened a door and there were these people just doing this fantastic painting of a certain sort, and they were very cross and thought they shouldn't be, and I thought they should, whatever, doesn't matter. But I mean, it's a good practice, you know what I mean? So anyway, so, and that's talking about academies, and which are kind of things that I agree, the idea of defining certain arts is very, very difficult. But what does matter is how we set up the structures for understanding, not understanding, i.e. comprehending, but, you know, this idea of education being something about sort of just being with something in time. And that's what learning is this kind of discussion through time, and you setting up discussions. And I was going to ask about the people from the Bronx and the youth. I mean, is there any chance they can ever go? Is there enough money for them to travel? Or is that going too far?
You know, it's interesting because when we thought about the engagement programs for the biennial, the first idea was that we're going to bring a group of kids here. But the more I thought about it, I just couldn't think what the educational value of that was. It was just going to be a very nice, you know, trip, you know, and then a lot of headaches for my staff to take care of 15 kids, you know, like lost in Venice. So we begin to have discussions about what was it that they could take from this, and then this structure that we set up with the IUAV and also with the Peggy Guggenheim Museum came about, and I think everyone got very excited because all of a sudden there were like very well-defined, let's say, benchmarks, like, you know, they're going to do this and they're going to do that and they're going to, so, and, you know, I have been an educator for all my life, and I think with kids you really have to, you know, tell them, you know, you have to deliver this, and it's just how I am. So, no, for me there was never, I think also to bring a group of kids here and expose to this environment.
Oh, horrible.
It's not just that it's horrible, but I just, it would take a lot of work from our end just to prepare them for that, how they can, you know, kind of experience that. So, and I think, you know, just kind of going back a little bit, I think this is a lot of what we do at the Bronx Museum, because we are in a community that it's sort of peripheral to Manhattan, and this issue of accessibility and language in many, many ways is huge. So a lot of what we do in education at the Bronx Museum is to expose especially young people to museum culture, which is something that in that community is not their priority. It's a lot of the kids that we work with, they are children of immigrant families, families that they work from 6 o'clock in the morning to 6 o'clock or 8 o'clock in the evening, and weekends they go to church or they go there, do their shopping, and so even the idea of going to a museum and spending some time looking at paintings, it just doesn't, So it's a lot of work in a sense to kind of introduce this idea and show the value of all that. So, so that is just a little bit of the background. So when we thought of doing this engagement program, we, all this sort of came to the table.
I mean, the reason I asked it was not because I think it's necessary, but this idea of, the idea of people going somewhere else and experiencing something, and yet what does that mean if something isn't sustained or isn't, the artist in residence whizzing around the world, and then you get this very false idea, which is that kind of notion of an international, an international language, which is not specific and not so interesting. Maybe.
I think that if you really experience something, this is a fact. And this is something that is deposited in you. I mean, perceptions are very powerful, They remain as a bodily experience, and then eventually they get developed in your brain and become an idea, a feeling, And so when you experience something, then this is done. I mean, if you're not experiencing the, let's say, happiness to be, or the easiness to speak, for instance, you might always have the fear and.
But even the frustration I think, is interesting in that if you can harness it. I mean, we're talking about curiosity, which at the end of the day should be.
Well, we all have reaction. We all have reaction, but that's kind of an emotional stuff, etc. But the point is, how do you act? The difference between reaction and action is crucial here. So, and we are not we are not educated to act. Unless we study and our profession, excuse me?
Could you just define a little bit what you mean by act, to act in?
Well, what I'm saying is that the action is something which is supposed to be a choice you do, something that represents you. A reaction is something that belongs to human beings, and are usually kept in your personal, intimate, and actually we are taught to just throw them away, or to discipline them by going to a psychotherapist, or this kind of thing. But reaction are something which are automatic, while actions are not automatic.
It's not automatic.
So my whole attempt through this experiment I did was, how can I trigger authentic or spontaneous actions? So this is the point. Because an action, when it is, and I was very aware that the problem was about emotions and reactions. So there was some cleaning up. There was a period. But the moment in which there is an energy of a certain, and you might know this as you do these talks, or you too, I mean, we all probably, if there is a certain energy and there is a seriousness and there is a willingness to cooperate, to interact, something very...
Anita, I wanted to ask you about these two words you put together, spontaneous and action.
I know, it's a good question.
How does that work?
Well, spontaneous because it's not defined, pre-organized in this sense, organic.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you act out words, I mean, I consider words actions, I mean, a word which is delivered, in like this here, is an action.
But is it also not a reaction? Is it so binary?
No, I don't think that it is, because you are engaged in bringing up something that you really feel and think. And when I talk about feeling, it's not about emotion. I feel. What we're trying to do here is resonating in a way, to create something.
Well, I think this is a really fascinating approach, but we are just kind of be the devil's advocate here and wonder whether this works for for certain audiences that they are already literate in some areas related to.
I tell you, it is not really proper to these leader figures because they're very selfish.
Yeah.
They want to have an audience. So I had major problems with them. With young people, for instance, because I at a certain point, actually, in this development of this process, I call it process rather than program, I really had to cut out or to say, okay, this is not a club, you know? So I said, okay, if you don't like it, just go, you know, very celebrities, you know. And then I decided to be very, not spontaneous, how do you say, chaotic. I just bumped into somebody, you know, a student, and I said, and that evening was public, I said, why don't you come, etc. And this kind of being so, it brought in a very, very good vibe, and it helped really steering a genuine, authentic coming together and creativity.
It's a good rule for giving parties, really, isn't it? I mean, it is.
Yeah, of course.
Because this idea of something slightly arbitrary has some
now the point
quality, which otherwise the total formality of everybody knowing, and who else is going to be there? Yuck.
In fact, I had always the first of the dinners, you know, and you know, my idea was like Platone, you know, with the symposium. You have to be a little bit loose, so you eat and you drink, but at the same time you have to be centered, focused. So this kind of difficult, you know, because otherwise, if you don't get loose, you know, by just chatting or having a drink together, etc., sitting all of a sudden around the table, it is almost impossible to get to a nice vibe.
But if I can make a reflection about the role of architecture we discussed before in relationship, this is a very good example, this Peckham Palace, I think, no, because it's very important to have a space of relation to incentive, to give possibility to have this social relationship. And in this case, this idea to have a landscape, an interior landscape, or what is also the social experience of Peckham. I know the Peckham Library is an experience of this type, by Will also. Very, very intensive for the social relationship. This role of architecture can be important to have this type of relationship, and in this case you can do this type of interaction in a better way.
I agree. This is a matter of setups, of space. So it's an architecture.
It's important.
Absolutely. In fact, you know, having a table and you sitting behind the table, having all the people in front of you, of course, it's the separation between observer, observed. I mean, there is no way to get out of that, you know. And in fact, I am very surprised. I did lectures. Well, lectures is a little different because you really have to report something about your experience. And yet I would change also the settings of that. But, you know, keeping always this kind of setup of somebody in the back, which is so hierarchical, you know. But it's hierarchical in the fact that it brings up emotions, you know, which are then kind of so filling that that you're not able to even catch up and follow, you know. Sometimes. And then they say, who has a question now? I mean, this is ridiculous, you know. This is really ridiculous.
But always that secondary thing.
Yes, it's a secondary.
The delivery, and then and it's very important to just be totally equal. I give you the opportunity to be like me or something like this. Is so, it's very ridiculous. And the idea that it's already been said somewhere else,
Yeah.
and this people are sort of secondary in that respect
Right.
as well.
Yeah.
But I think the title of this session was, I mean, education and so on, but also workshop. And what we're talking about is not sort of, we're talking about something like maybe learning like the guilds in London or the guilds in Florence or that idea, or then I wanted to kind of question the way, for instance, you would have a studio, you know, art schools in Germany, very traditionally there'd be one, usually a bloke, teacher, and then there'd be people learning through that, and that kind of model as opposed to sort of something, but what we're talking about is something collective.
Yeah.
A lot of my friends sort of came out of an art school in Lahore, where particularly, say, the miniature department, who's one of whose protege is who did the roof garden at the Met right now in Ron Qureshi. Now there, for 6 months, the first 6 months when you enter, all you do is draw parallel lines in 1 inch by 1 inch squares with a sharpened pencil, which you can, if you fall on that, you die. And all you're doing is to learn control over your hand. And then, you know, the master will say, yes, okay, now you have control over hand, now you can do this. And you do that for several years. And you know, the sort of what you were talking about, this tension between, you know, being, I mean, the thing I was thinking of was say something like, you know, Tai Chi or Zen archery, where the aim may be to have no aim.
Right.
But you have a lifetime of discipline.
But you are in the present.
Which is, you know, which
you are in the
moocs you.
present.
The biggest currency right now is language. And yesterday we were talking about technology, but basically we're talking about language. But it's how language actually became so objectified through the media and this and that.
Yeah.
But you know, behind that, it's a language. It's like it's the only thing that we have now, right? In terms of culture, in terms of, and I think the more artists understand that, and I think. You know, therapy is a good way to kind of think about language.
No, I think we are underselling artists. I think artists are very smart people, and I think in terms of when you look at, you know, if you were to pick one point, if you pick sort of Okwi's Documenta, and you see the number of artists who didn't train in art, who were part of that Documenta, who saw within what we, you know, the art world, a certain mobility and openness to do things. I mean, if I'm taking one example, say the Indian filmmaker Amar Kanwar, who trained as a filmmaker, you know, was making corporate videos, was working with NGOs as an activist, and is the only artist who was in all three, you know, the last documentas. Yeah. And what he's doing with his art, you know, the thing in the last documenta, is now permanently installed in the community from which it came. So these rice, you know, this region in Orissa in India. So it's about also using some of that facility, that the language. So when you have the facility with that language, you can make it do things for you. And I think artists are very alive to that.
Yeah. But language is a shared system of signs. So language becomes
it's a social construct.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think that we are also in the process of getting into this shared system of system of shared signs, of the shared understanding. So this is and this is again a process in which we are in. I'm not that negative.
And that's kind of interesting because you know, before we started here, I was meeting ANITA, and I told her that I was very happy to meet her because she worked with Antonioni.
Yeah.
So
actually, Antonioni had already had stroke, so he didn't speak at all.
Right.
So it was very interesting.
But I was thinking in terms of this meeting today, the film Blow Up by Antonioni, which is fantastic for many, many reasons, but I was just proposing that there is something wonderful in the role of the photographer, that his hubris and his bravado, and he wants to be socially relevant, and he wants to be socially engaged, but he basically does not know what he's doing.
Exactly.
And you know, the crux of the film is that he's photographing the park, and later he realizes that he photographed the scene of a crime. So I think I always took that as kind of a fantastic metaphor for what we do in art. which is basically we really go blindly, and we do beautiful things and we do very articulate things, but ultimately we do not know what we are doing, and it's generations that come later that will, you know, reinterpret and reinterpret, and I think that's.
And we should educate people to be like this.
Well,
to be
that's,
not
and we
knowing.
need to educate people to be like that
Yeah.
Right.
in art education.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So the idea of working at something but not knowing what it is sort of quite old-fashioned, apparently. So the idea of constructing a sort of a total accountability around your practice and knowing what that is definitely. And the idea that he did that is a bit like somebody, old-fashioned artist, sort of making abstract painting, turning around and then turning around quickly and hoping it's going to say something different. Of course it's not. I mean, it's not going to be a dead body there. But like there is in Blow Up. But there is this idea of sort of hope of maybe something coming out of practice or work that is not something that isn't totally directed in that way. And that's when people can then say what they see,
Right.
because there isn't something they have to know at the same level.
It's not an assumption.
Yeah, so there's not that.
Yeah, I mean, last week I had the good fortune of sharing a platform with the Iranian filmmaker Abbas Kiarostami. And we're talking about his, I don't know if you've seen the film Shireen.
No, I haven't.
So what he did was he sort of, you know, invited 117 women from, you know, age 17 to age 80s to just talk for to emote on camera for 6 minutes about something that has moved them in their life.
Yeah.
And so he had these 700 minutes of these women emoting on camera, silent, no sound. And then he set about saying, right, what am I going to do with this?
So there's a raw material.
There's just raw material, yeah. And originally his idea was Romeo and Juliet. He found he couldn't get the copyright, so he said, forget Romeo and Juliet. He got people to do Shireen and Khusro, which is a sort of Persian, analogy to it. And that then, so it's as if you're watching all these women watching something that didn't actually take place, but that's the film, and that's a 100-odd minute film.
But that's the process of what art is.
Yeah.
You start something, you have a vague idea, and then you see what you have done, and then you relate with what you have, and then it becomes different, and it leads you somewhere else. So it is the process itself that takes you.
Do you know,
It's interesting because mentioning Antonioni, there's a very good exhibition in Ferrara now on Antonioni and the art. The relationship is very, very important in the work of Antonioni, and there's a spot of Monica Vitti making something like this you say, because it's all a sequence of emotions, not talking, and it's perfect to reflect the intimate emotions. So it's fantastic.
Well, I think that's been utterly fantastic for us. Anyway, I hope it's been such a great experience. Thank you all very much. And I'm going to go off now and do some interactive something over there. So which is looks very exciting. Where I have a touchpad, and therefore I hopefully collectively involve myself with that art experience. So thank you all very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Utterly brilliant.